So this morning, I looked at the idea of setting psychology free. So because in order to understand the Bible, we have to understand how the human mind works and how it interfaces with biblical stories and biblical history. So I wanted now to kind of lead in very gently into the trial, putting God on trial for crimes against humanity. And I'm going to go in gently into the first lecture and then pick up steam tomorrow in the prosecution. And to begin with, in the book, I included what I consider to be a very funny letter from Dr. Laura Schlessinger. But not only is it a funny letter, it's whimsical, it's scripturally very, very accurate, and it raises genuine concerns about what we mean by divine inspiration in the biblical passages. So I'm going to read the letter. This was somebody writing to Dr. Laura Schlessinger. I've never heard her, but I believe she's a kind of a radio kind of a host, who fields questions of various kinds. So here was the letter. So Dr. Laura Schlessinger is an outspoken advice giver on matters of morals and relationships. And she announced on her radio show that as an observant Orthodox Jew, she believed homosexuality to be an abomination in accordance with Leviticus chapter 18, verse 22, and is not to be condoned under any circumstances. And the following was an open, tongue-in-cheek letter to her asking her advice about some other laws from the book of Leviticus and actually from the book of Exodus as well. And it says this: Dear Dr. Laura, thank you for doing so much to educate people regarding God's law. I've learned a great deal from your show and try to share that knowledge with as many people as I can. When someone tries to defend the homosexual lifestyle, for example, I simply remind them that Leviticus chapter 18, verse 22 states it to be an abomination. End of debate. I do need some advice from you, however, regarding some other elements of God's laws and how to follow them. Leviticus chapter 25, verse 44 states that I may possess slaves, both male and female, provided they are from neighboring nations. A friend of mine claims that this applies to Mexicans, but not Canadians. Can you clarify? Why can't I own Canadians? I would like to sell my daughter into slavery, as is sanctioned in Exodus chapter 21, verse 7. In this day and age, what do you think would be a fair price for her? I know that I'm allowed no contact with a woman while she is in her period of menstrual uncleanness, Leviticus chapter 15, verse 19. The problem is, how do I tell? I have tried asking, but most women take offense. When I burn a bull on the altar as a sacrifice, I know it creates a pleasing odor for the Lord, Leviticus chapter 1, verse 9. The problem is my neighbors. They claim the odor is not pleasing to them. Should I smite them? I have a neighbor who insists on working on the Sabbath. Exodus chapter 35, verse 2 clearly states he should be put to death. Am I morally obligated to kill him myself, or should I ask the police to do it? A friend of mine feels that although eating shellfish is an abomination, Leviticus chapter 11, verse 10, it is a lesser abomination than homosexuality. I don't agree. Can you settle this? Are there degrees of abomination? Leviticus chapter 21, verse 20 states that I may not approach the altar of God if I have a defect in my sight. I have to admit that I wear reading glasses. Does my vision have to be 20/20, or is there some wiggle room here? Most of my male friends get their hair trimmed, including the hair around their temples, even though this is expressly forbidden by Leviticus chapter 19, verse 27. How should they die? I know from Leviticus chapter 11, verses 6 to 8, that touching the skin of a dead pig makes me unclean. But may I still play football if I wear gloves? My uncle has a farm. He violates Leviticus chapter 19, verse 19, by planting 2 different crops in the same field, as does his wife by wearing garments made from two different kinds of thread, cotton, polyester blend. He also tends to curse and blaspheme a lot. Is it necessary that we go to all the trouble of getting the whole town together to stone them? Leviticus 24, verses 10 to 16. Couldn't we just burn them to death in a private family affair, like we do with people who sleep with their in-laws? Leviticus chapter 20, verse 14. I know you study these things extensively and thus enjoy considerable expertise in such matters, so I'm confident you can help. Thank you again for reminding us that God's word is eternal and unchanging. And as I said, this is a whimsical letter, but it is scripturally actually very precise. And it obviously raises grave concerns about the issue of the divine inspiration in some of the parts of the Bible. And so that's what I want to get into in this first kind of prosecutorial look at some of the passages in the Hebrew scriptures. So firstly, I want to look at the question of revelation. What do we mean when we say the Bible is the revealed word of God? Typically, when you hear the word revelation, especially when we're talking about the scriptures, we're thinking that revelation means that the message comes directly from God. Now, the problem is that revelation just simply means uncovering what was previously hidden. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's divinely inspired. It just means to reveal means to make, visible that which was previously hidden. It's the same kind of a difference between, let's say, something which is unknowable and something which is unknown. They're very different. Unknowable means that something in its essence cannot be comprehended by human effort. It cannot be discovered. It can't be invented without some kind of, supernatural intervention, if it's really unknowable. Unknown, on the other hand, is just a state of being like temporarily hidden. So it can be discovered or it can be invented. So we get the same kind of distinction between invisible and not visible. So for instance, invisible is something that can never be seen, ever, like the soul. The soul is invisible. So I remember as a small child, I was about 4 or 5 years old, and I asked my grandparents, where's the soul? In what part of my body is the soul? And they said, no, the soul is invisible. It can't be seen. And in my 4-year-old mind, I'm thinking, I think I know where it is. I couldn't understand the difference between not visible and invisible. I was convinced that the soul was like a plate and it was hidden somewhere inside in the belly. And that if I committed a sin, there'd be a black mark on the plate, on my soul. And I couldn't figure out why the adults, weren't aware of that the soul obviously was inside in the body. It was like a little plate and you could put dirty marks on it. And when you went to confession, you could scrub it clean. So I couldn't get the distinction between invisible and simply not visible. So for instance, at 10 o'clock tonight in California, at least, the sun won't be visible anymore. But the sun is not invisible. It'll rise again in the morning, sometime around 7 o'clock. So these are important distinctions when we talk about revelation or unknowable versus unknown or invisible versus not visible. Now, whatever way you cut it, even if you believe that God is involved in this process some way, that somehow God is related, however tangentially, to the notion of revelation, we have to realize that the revelation wasn't made to you or to me. So the revelation obviously was made to somebody way back, like 3,000 years ago. And they told it to somebody who told it to somebody who told it to somebody who told it to somebody else. So you're in a long lineage of listeners, all of whom believed that the person who told them was correct because they heard it from people who told them and assured them it was correct. So you've got this long line of he said, she said, this long line. And we still believe, it's the real word of God. Now, as I was saying this morning, Thomas Aquinas tells us that there's a big difference between what epistemology does, and what ontology does. Epistemology is literally just how we gather data. Epistemology is how we know what we know. And we know how we know basically by listening to an authority or having an experience or on our own or figuring stuff out for ourselves. But that's no guarantee that something is true. So epistemology is simply gathering the data. Then comes an ontology. An ontology is trying to sort out the truth from the lies. And so it's about discernment, a faculty of discernment. Every single human proposition has to be subjected to a discernment process in order for you to subscribe to it, to say, yeah, I believe this to be true, or no, I reject that as falsehood. And so we have to do the same thing with divine revelation. We have to discern among the stories which of the stories are true, and very, very often we're talking about different levels of this. For instance, are you talking about the literal meaning of a passage? So, for instance, when Jesus Christ says, if your right eye scandalize you, pluck it out and throw it away from you. Better to enter heaven with one eye than to enter hell with two eyes. If your right leg scandalizes you and walks you into sin, cut it off and throw it away. Better to enter heaven with one leg than to enter Gehenna with two legs. Now, if you take that literally, then heaven is populated by blind amputees. And so obviously, we don't take it literally. So when we talk about divine revelation, what level of unpacking or interpretation will you employ? Is it a literal meaning? Is it a symbolic meaning? Or is it a mystical meaning? So once you accept that somehow revelation means that God is involved in somewhere in the equation, you then have to ask yourself the question, as I read this passage, can I interpret it literally, symbolically, or mystically? So in other words, to ascertain the truth of the Bible, you have to learn to think very, very critically. You have to distinguish, historical aberrations like partisan politics that got involved in the stories that got in, or that got redacted. The original texts of the Bible that we now read, were fashioned in a petri dish of much more barbaric times. And so we have to kind of unpack it and clean it up a little bit. Even the language has to be cleaned up very, very often. I'll give you an example. I hope I don't offend any pious minds. When the Israelites were encouraged to institute the ban, to wipe out peoples, the ban consisted of two different forms. But one of the bans was to kill all the males. When you conquer a village, kill all the males. You can spare the women and children and take them as booty, but you have to kill all the males. Now, the only problem is, in the original Hebrew, it did not use the word males. It said, and this is exactly the translation that was done, by in the Catholic scriptures in the 1500s. It does not say kill all the males. It says kill everyone who pisses against the wall. And that was the definition of male. Now we've cleaned up the language, and we've interpreted what it meant, but that was the actual language. When Jesus, for instance, is talking in the New Testament, and again, I hope I'm not being offensive to anybody, he was asked, he was told, are there clean foods and unclean foods? He says, there's no such thing as unclean foods. Everything that God made is clean. It's not what goes into us that makes us unclean. It's what comes out of us that makes us unclean. Our thoughts or anger or whatever. He says, everything that goes into us winds up in, and the word he uses, the Greek word that's used, it's not a latrine, it's not a long drop. In actual fact, the word that's used is, Jesus says, everything that you eat goes into the shithole, is the phrase that's used in the Greek. The Greeks had words for a latrine and for a long drop, but this was the phrase that's used in the New Testament. So either Jesus is using it to shock his audience, or the Bible writers are using it to shock their audiences, but that was the language which is employed. And so now we clean up a lot of this language. And then instead of, using just male pronouns, we include female pronouns because we believe that's what was intended, that God was addressing all her children, not just the males among us. So we have to realize then, as we're unpacking these scriptures, there's a lot of massaging that goes on in order literally just to clean up the language or clean up the intentionality. So for instance, when Paul says in the New Testament, wives, be obedient to your husbands. In church, you have to keep your mouth shut. If you have a question, keep it until you go home and then ask your husband. Now, how do you clean up that idea when you translate the New Testament right now? Do you have to take that story out of it? Do you have to take that teaching of Paul out of it? Or do you include it and then say, that was the message for his time and place? It's a different message for our time and our place. But we have to honor what the original actually said. And so we have to realize that as we're reading our modern translations of the Bible, there's a whole bunch of cleaning up has happened. A whole bunch of reinterpretation has happened. And if you're not off fair with the originals, you miss that out completely, and you don't see the trajectory through which the Bible and its translations have traveled. We have to realize as well that we talk about the Bible as if it were a single book. The Greek word, or it's a phrase actually that's used, is ta biblia, which literally means the books, because the Bible is actually a library. And depending on whether you're Jewish or Protestant or Catholic, there's a different number of books in the Bible. So in the Hebrew scriptures, there are 39 books, but there are 7 books that are kind of a pseudo-epigraphical. And so when the Protestants created their Bible, they followed the Jewish version. They took 39 books from the Hebrew scriptures and added 27 from the Christian scriptures, winding up with a total of 66 books. But the Catholics took the pseudo-epigraphica, the apocryphal writings, 7 other books, and they included them in the Old Testament. And then they added the 27 books of the New Testament. So in the Catholic Bible, there are 73 books. Protestant Bible, 66, Catholic Bible, 73, Hebrew scriptures, 39. So we have to realize, which version of the scriptures are you talking about then? And you have to realize that whatever number of books you include, there are totally different genres of literature. There are books of law, books of history, books of liturgy and ritual, riddles, letters, theological treatises, mythology, parables, eschatology, which is the theory of the end times, hymnals, the Psalms, prophecies, wisdom literature like the Proverbs. They're all mixed into the same, Bible. Now, cracking open the Bible then and just dipping in someplace and thinking that you can engage meaningfully with the content is as ridiculous as realizing that when you get your Sunday newspaper and you see there are several sections of the paper, there's like the comic section, there's the gardening section, there's the movie section, there's the financial section, there's the foreign news section. And as you're reading from section to section, unbeknownst to yourself, you're totally changing your mindset. You're not reading the comic section with the same mindset that you're reading, for instance, the financial section. You're shifting your mindset significantly, but you're doing it unconsciously. You're not even aware that that's happening. Now, to open the Bible and think that you can engage with all of this material with a single mindset is absolutely ludicrous. But that's what a lot of people do. So when I talk about revelation, then that's what I have in mind. You have to be really aware of all of these caveats as you engage with this extraordinary book. I want to look then at the notion of biblical inerrancy, or the notion that since the Bible is the revealed word of God, then it's infallible. Everything it says, it's absolutely true. There are various levels of how biblical scholars treat the notion of biblical inerrancy. So one group of scholars think that they're just, the scriptures are just generically inspired, that basically the writers of scripture just were kind of generically inspired by God, but that God didn't dictate the text to them. So that's the kind of the most lax version, that people just got inspired and said, oh yeah, I think this is what happened. Let me write it down. I think this is coming from God. That's the first stage. The next stage is that there are people who believe that the Holy Spirit was actually involved here and was directing the words that were going to be used, the message that was going to come through, and how the material was supposed to be collated. Put a paragraph here, put a full stop here, a comma there. So there are some people who actually believe that the Holy Spirit dictated to all of the writers, telling them exactly what to include, what words to use, when to break for a new paragraph, or when to put a semicolon. So that's a second position. A third position says that, the first two positions are, true, but there's much more than that, that the Bible is infallible when it speaks on matters of faith and practice, but not necessarily when it talks about science or about history. And so it's very obvious, in fact, when you read the Bible, that it's very, very often historically totally inaccurate and scientifically absolutely inaccurate. The story in Genesis of what the world looks like is that it's a flat disc set up in pillars with a dome on top. and there are holes in the dome, and the sun is shining through it, and the rain is falling through it, and the pillars are holding it up from the abyss that lies underneath the earth. So again and again and again, the science of the Bible is totally made up. And very often, the history of the Bible is totally made up. And so the third position is that it's not infallible in everything. It's only infallible when it speaks about matters of faith and morals, but not necessarily when it talks about history or about scientific matters. So that's a third position. A fourth position is that people who hold that the Bible is actually infallible in all matters, no exceptions whatsoever. And so there was a famous Irish bishop around the 1600s, Bishop Ussher. He was a bishop of Armagh in Ireland, who went through chronologically the Hebrew scriptures, and he estimated that the world was created on the 29th of October at 8 a.m. in the year 4001 BCE. And if you actually go through the chronology of the Bible, you could prove that that's true using the chronology of the Bible. Now, do you believe then that the world that we are sitting on right now and the universe in which we live is just about 6,000 years old? And when people pointed out that there were dinosaur bones, recovered in the fossil record dating back 65 million years of age, these people's response was that the devil planted the bones to confuse people, so that they wouldn't believe that the Bible was accurate when it showed the age of the universe. So that's a fourth position, that the Bible is absolutely infallible in all matters, scientific, historical, faith, and morals. And then the fifth position, and the most egregious of all, is that not only is it infallible in all matters, but it is literally true on all topics, meaning that John Smith can come in off the street. John Smith has a primary school education. He's barely literate, but he can open the Bible at any part and he can read it and understand it and know exactly what it means, because it's literally true. Everything it says is literally true. So that's kind of when you talk about biblical belief and then the inerrancy of the Bible, you have to ask yourself the question, into which of these categories do I fall as I kind of engage with this extraordinarily beautiful and mystical material? It gets even more confusing in a sense, because if you were reading the originals, it's one thing. However, when you're reading translations, you've got a whole bunch of other problems. And I've pointed out many, many times that there are huge problems when you start translating from any language to any language. So particularly when you translate the Hebrew scriptures, Hebrew originally had no orthography. There was no writing. Hebrew did not have an alphabet. The alphabet was invented by the Phoenicians about the year 1150 BCE. They created the alphabet. Before that, you only had hieroglyphics, thousands of symbols, and you had cuneiform, thousands of symbols. So the Phoenicians were the geniuses who telescoped it all down, and they created what in linguistics is called phonemes. A phoneme is the shortest sound the human voice can make. And so, for instance, a phoneme is shorter even than a syllable. If I use a syllable, for instance, I, as in I went home, I actually is two phonemes. It is I. To pronounce the syllable I, there's actually two phonemes, I. And so the phonemes are the shortest sounds that the human tongue and palate can make. So the Phoenicians created an alphabet based on phonemes, and they reduced the complexity of, cuneiform down to just 22 symbols. And the Romans borrowed that, and the Greeks borrowed that, and the Hebrews borrowed that. So the Hebrew scripture, the modern Hebrew has just 22 syllables. The Irish, alphabet only has 20 symbols. English has 26. And then when you include stuff like the Hung of South Africa, the glottal languages, there are other sounds that that can't be created by our alphabet. But basically, the alphabet shrunk language down to 22 symbols. So when you translate then from language to language, you're going from the original Hebrew scriptures, which did not have a written form because they didn't have a written language. And then it doesn't have vowels. When you write it down, Hebrew does not have vowel signs. Modern Hebrew does not have vowel signs. If you're reading a modern Hebrew newspaper, you have to insert the appropriate vowel signs depending on the context. And so there's a huge problem. If we left out the vowels in the English language, and I wrote a statement to you, and the statement was G-D L-V-S, how would you translate that? Does it mean God loves, or God lives, or good loves? Or how would you infer the real meaning from it if we left out just kept the consonants and left out the vowels? So Hebrew has no vowel signs. In the 12th century, they created a system called the Masoretic text, where they put marks under the consonants to indicate particular vowel sounds. So now you take a language which had no orthography, finally it gets a written form, and now you translate it, say, for instance, into Kalenjin, one of the languages that I had to use in Kenya. And Kalenjin had no orthography. There was no written version of Kalenjin. It was invented by the missionaries, 60 or 70 or 80 years ago. And Kalenjin is semitonal. So you can make a sound in Kalenjin, and depending on the intonation, it'll mean something very, very different. For instance, Giplewet in Kalenjin can mean either a rabbit or a fetus, depending on where you put how the cadence goes. So now you take a language which originally didn't have a written format, has no vowel signs, and you translate it into Kalenjin that didn't have an orthography and is semitonal, and then you start trying to translate it. And you take, like, say, a parable of Jesus, where Jesus tells a parable. He says, the kingdom of heaven is like a man who sowed wheat in his field. And while he was asleep, his enemy came and sowed cockle among the wheat. And after a few months, it became obvious. The servants came and said, Master, didn't you sow good seed in your ground? How come it's got all these weeds in it? And the master said, an enemy of mine has done this. And they asked him, should we pluck up the weeds? And the master says, no, because you could pluck up the wheat with it. Now, even for us modern Europeans and Americans, we don't even get the significance of that, because wheat and cockle are crops that grew in the Middle East, and they're identical in the original stages of their germination. If you see wheat growing and cockle growing in the same field, you can't initially distinguish between them. They're totally look-alike until they get a bit bigger. And then you can see the difference between them. And then you could meaningfully pluck them out. But we don't even get the meaning to that. When Christ says, when we hear that parable, we can't unpack it properly, because we don't realize that there's this similarity between the cockle and the wheat. Now you come and you translate that into a Kalenjin language. The peoples I worked with, they had no agriculture whatsoever. They were nomadic pastoralists. They never heard of wheat, let alone cockle. And so the first missionaries that, translated the Bible into this language, they had to invent words. So the word for food in Kalenjin is bainik. And so they're now using that word bainik to mean wheat. And then they had to make up a word for cockle. So they made up a new word called chemul bainik, which literally means that which imitates wheat. Talk about beating people over the head with the kind of the punchline of the joke. And so there's the problem. You're translating from a language which originally had no orthography, now has no vowel signs, translating to a language that didn't have an orthography like Kalenjin, that's semitonal, and that some of the allusions like wheat and cockle are totally meaningless to a population that was not agricultural. And now you're depending upon this translation of the original languages to try to make sense of what you're reading. So when you're reading in translation, you're at a huge disadvantage. So there was a movement in the 1700s that claimed only the original languages were inspired by God. If you read them in translation, the translations are not inspired by God. But there's one exception. The King James Version is the only translation that was inspired by God, that the people who made that translation into English were inspired as well by God. And that's the only valid translation. The Catholic Church had their own version. At the Council of Trent, which went on from about 1546 to 1562, they said that there's only one version of the scriptures, one translation that they agree is real. And that was a translation done by St. Jerome. He flourished about the year 380 AD. And he translated the original from the original Hebrew into Latin, and from the original New Testament, which was written in Greek, into Latin, and it's called the Vulgate, the popular version. And so the Council of Trent decreed that this was the only authentic official Bible of the Catholic Church. All of the other versions or translations were anathema. So now you can see that there's huge wiggle room when you're looking at biblical texts. These were texts that were created over a period of almost 1,000 years. The first written version of the Hebrew scriptures comes from about 950 BCE, before the Common Era. And the last books of the New Testament are written about the year 100 AD. So you're talking about a span of over 1,000 years. And you've got literally hundreds of writers of these scriptures. And so basically, the Bible that you hold in your hand is the result of an ongoing ancient conversation between oral traditions and particular faith communities, with many, many different kinds of voices getting in the act. You know, the conversation is affected by political considerations at the time, cultural considerations, theological considerations, health considerations, economic considerations. And so now here we are in the year 2022, and we've got, you know, fundamentalist Christians believing that they can literally take a Bible, you know, open it, crack it open, and understand what it means. So this is the craziness, you know, of biblical times. And so before we open the Bible whatsoever, we have to make a real act of humility and realize that this is extraordinary material. You know, am I qualified even to open it and to begin reading it? Or am I qualified to make sense of it? And the answer is yes, I'm qualified, because it's a mystical, you know, set of stories that have sustained, you know, generations of people all over the world in the vicissitude of dealing with incarnational life experiences. But we have to do it with tremendous humility and some level of scholarship, or at least some level of research, so we have some kind of a clue what we're doing. So that's the second point I wanted to make. I want to now just look at some what I'm calling biblical tidbits, just to kind of factoids which are interesting. There are about 5 billion printed copies of the Bible. It's easily the best-selling book of all time. There are about 100 million copies sold annually. And, you know, it has exercised a huge influence, not just on Judeo-Christianity, but on history, particularly a European and a New World history. It has exercised an extraordinary influence on literature, on art, on architecture, on music, and on civilization itself. And so even if you're an avowed atheist, if you have any knowledge of the history of our species, you have to realize that there is no place you can go and nothing you can look at which hasn't been influenced by this extraordinary book. Whether you're looking at the architecture of, you know, of Europe, or you're looking at the literature of, you know, modern American writers, wherever you look, whatever art form you're looking at something that has been deeply influenced by this extraordinary book. The Gutenberg Bible in the 1490s was the first book ever printed using kind of movable type. Actually, the Chinese had gotten there hundreds of years before, but in a very unsophisticated fashion. Johann Gutenberg was the first one who could make movable type. So it meant you could create countless copies. And the very first book that he printed using movable type was the Bible. The oldest extant copy, complete copy of the entire Bible, is called the Codex Vaticanus, and it is held in the Vatican Library. It's a 4th century CE, you know, Common Era, a parchment or books. That's the oldest extant complete version of the Bible, held in the Vatican archives. The original languages then, of course, of the Old Testament was basically Hebrew, but there are a few passages in the book of Ezra, in the book of Jeremiah, and the book of Daniel, which are in a biblical Aramaic. But 95% of the Hebrew scriptures are written in the Hebrew language, whereas the entire New Testament is written in Koine Greek. And so as you're reading the Bible, you have to realize, you know, these are the original languages. And as you translate from these languages, you have to be aware, you know, that they are translations from much more ancient texts. In the original Bible then, when Gutenberg created his Bible, or when you get a version, Judeo-Christian scriptures, the original was just one complete text. There were no breaks whatsoever. So you had complete books or complete letters that were put into this Bible. In the year 1226 AD, The Archbishop of Canterbury, a guy called Stephen Langton, he broke the books into chapters. So originally, if you looked at, for instance, the writings of Jeremiah, the entire writings of Jeremiah were just a single continuous text. If you look at Isaiah, which is actually the longest book in the Bible, it's 66 chapters. It wasn't 66 chapters, it was just one continuous text. So in 1226, Stephen Langton took each of these sets of writings and he divided them into books so that it was much more easy, they could be much more easily referenced. Instead of saying this is contained in the book of Jeremiah, you could say this is contained in chapter 31 of the book of Jeremiah. And in 1551, a French printer called Robert Estienne, he took the books that Langton had created and he divided each of the books into verses. So as you read, so it went from a continuous script to breaking into chapters, and now he's breaking each chapter into verses. So now instead of saying, this is contained in Isaiah, in the book of Isaiah, you can say, this is Isaiah chapter 7, verse 14. And now you can pinpoint it much more accurately. So it was an extraordinary mitzvah, an extraordinary gift that these two people gave us. Makes it very, very easy to reference the Bible. When you look at the Hebrew scriptures part of it, there's an acronym that the Jews will use when talking about their sacred scriptures. It's called the Tanakh. So basically TNKH. And T stands for Torah, which are the 5 first books of the Hebrew scriptures, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And the belief system among Orthodox Jews was that, the Torah was written by Moses, that Moses wrote the first 5 books of the Hebrew scriptures. Now, later on, I'll take that argument asunder completely. So the T represents then Torah, meaning the law. N stands for Nevi'im. Nevi'im means prophets, and it's very close to Swahili is a cross between a Semitic language, Arabic, and the Bantu language of East Africa. So there's a lot of similarities between our Arabic and Swahili. And so in Swahili, the word for prophets is Nabi, and in Hebrew, it's Nevi'im. And so N stands for the prophetic literature within the Hebrew scriptures. And then K stands for Ketuvim. In Hebrew, Ketuvim means books. And in Swahili, it was very, very similar. The word in Swahili for a book is kitabu, and in plural is vitabu. And so the K in the Hebrew means the writings. So the Torah was ascribed to Moses. Nevi'im was ascribed to the prophets, and the prophets particularly flourished between Elijah is regarded as the first of them. He flourished about 850 BCE, and the last of the prophets is about 400 BCE. And so the period of the prophets is roughly about 400 years. And Judaism believed that the last of the prophets was Malachi, about 400 BCE. The wisdom literature comes from a different part of Jewish history. So in 721 BCE, the northern tribes of Israel were destroyed. In 933 BCE, there had been a civil war in Israel, and it was divided into 2 groups. The northern kingdom that called itself Israel now consisted of 10 tribes, and the southern kingdom consisted of two tribes, the tribe of Judah and the tribe of Benjamin, centered on Jerusalem. In 721 BCE, the northern kingdom of Israel was destroyed by the Assyrian Empire, and the 10 tribes are taken into exile and they disappear from world history. 130 years later, in the year 598 BCE, the Babylonian Empire, which in the meantime had overthrown the Assyrian Empire, now conquered the southern kingdom of Judah. And in 589 BCE, they destroyed the temple which had been built by Solomon about 950 BCE, and they exiled the last 2 tribes of Israel to Babylon, where they remained for almost 70 years in exile. While they were in Babylon, Babylon finally fell to the Persian Empire, and the Persians brought in their own religion called Zoroastrianism. Zoroaster was a great Persian prophet. And Zoroaster was the first great prophet who shrunk the multiplicity of gods down to 2 gods, from the pluriformity of divinities that the peoples of the world worshipped. Zoroastrianism claimed there were only two gods, a god of light and a god of dark. The god of light was Ahura Mazda, and the god of dark was Ahriman. And so they telescoped it down just to two gods. This had a huge impact on the Jews living in exile. Zoroastrianism also believed in angels and spirits and life after death. And so when the Jews were finally free to come back to the land of Israel, when Cyrus the Great, conquered the Babylonians and set the Jewish nations free to come back to Israel, and this wasn't just out of the goodness of his heart, he needed a strong ally on his western flank to defend against the Egyptians, who were now rising at that stage as well. And so he released the Judeans to go back to the land of Israel. And they carried this new form of spirituality and scholarship back with them. And that's called the wisdom literature. At that period, you get stuff like the book of Job and Proverbs and stuff like that. Now, at the time of Jesus, the Pharisee group believed in all three parts, Torah, Nevi'im, and Ketuvim. But the priestly caste did not believe in the Ketuvim. They believed in the Torah and the Nevi'im, but not the Ketuvim. And so there's a famous debate at one stage between Jesus and the Sadducees. The Sadducees were the priestly caste. And so the Sadducees decided they'd kind of make fun of Jesus. So according to the Mosaic law, if a man dies and he's childless, his brother is mandated to marry the widow and raise up children to the dead brother. It's called the Levirate law. So the Sadducees come to Jesus with this kind of trick question that's going to demolish the notion of life after death. And they said to him, Master, we know that you're a great teacher and you understand, our spiritual tradition. We have a problem. There was a certain man who was married and he died childless. So his brother married the widow to raise up children to his dead sibling, and he died childless. So the second brother married her and he died childless. And eventually all 7 brothers married this woman and they all died childless. So now tell us this. In the life after death, whose wife is she going to be? Ha ha ha. And they thought this was the ultimate argument. They had demolished the notion of life after death. And of course, Christ demolished them in 2 different ways. He said, have you never read what Moses said? When God appeared to Moses in the burning bush and Moses asked him to identify himself, God said to Moses, I am the God of Abraham and the God of Isaac and the God of Jacob. Now, Abraham lived about 1850 BCE and Moses flourished about 1250 BCE, 600 years later. And Christ then says to him, do you think God was identifying himself by aligning himself with the dead? So in heaven, he goes on and says, in heaven, there is neither marriage nor giving in marriage. We are spirit beings. We don't have physical spacesuits that need to express themselves in a kind of a sexual encounter. We express ourselves by a spiritual commingling, which is much more exciting. This is my interpretation, obviously, which is much more exciting even than physical sex is. And so he demolishes them on 2 fronts. Firstly, by appealing to the scriptures they actually believed in, the law of Moses, and then secondly, by going into the realization that the afterlife is not about taking our spacesuits with us, but being totally spirit beings. And one final little tidbit before I open it up for Q&A. In the year 1631, the royal printers in England were commissioned by the king at the time to do a reprint of the King James Bible. So they did a reprint of the entire book, but they omitted a single word, the word not, from the commandment that says, thou shalt not commit adultery. They forgot to include the word not. And so the Revised Version said, thou shalt commit adultery. As you can imagine, there was pandemonium. It now became known as the Wicked Bible. And the printers were fired. They were fined a huge amount and they were dismissed as royal printers forever. And the Archbishop of Canterbury and the king at the time were freaking out. And some of those copies survived. There's actually one of those copies in a library in New York City. And it's called The Wicked Bible. So there we go. Tomorrow, God loving, I'm going to pick up now and go in much more detail into prosecuting this caricature of God we've created. obviously, this is not a book to be taken lightly for a number of reasons. It's an extraordinary mystical, a combination of writings of various kinds. And so to feel that you can just pick it up and read it and understand it, it's kind of it's hubris, scriptural hubris to do that. And so it's up to us, if we're serious about trying to mine the messages of the scriptures, to at least educate ourselves on it. Initially to figure out, when I dip into a particular part of the Bible, what genre of literature am I encountering? Is this a historical book? Is it, poetry? Is it a letter of Paul? Is it kind of about the end times? Is it about, parables of Jesus? So what genre of literature am I encountering here? The second thing then is to come to it prayerfully and to realize that there are many different ways of unpacking it. There's a literal meaning, there's a symbolic meaning, and there's a mystical meaning. And so to really ask for guidance about how these stories might impact you in 2022. Now, when I continue with the prosecution and the defense over the next 2 days, I'm going to bring in expert witnesses. Tomorrow I'm going to bring in, for the prosecution, I'm going to bring in a Bible scholar, and I'm going to bring in a clinical psychologist, and I'm going to bring in a contract lawyer. And then for the defense, I'm going to bring in a second Bible scholar. I'm going to bring in an archaeologist. I'm going to bring in a mythologist, and I'm going to bring in a Jungian analyst. And so we're going to get 7 very different perspectives on how to kind of deal with this kind of material. So hopefully, by the end of the retreat, or for those who are reading the book, you'll get, 7 very, very different hits on how to deal with this material. Yes, I know the Course in Miracles is a beautifully profound book. Personally, I do not believe that Jesus or any heavenly being dictates anything to us. I think they inspire us. If I taught for several years in Kenya, if I go up to the blackboard, and I take a piece of white chalk and I write, today is Tuesday. And then I take a piece of red chalk and I write up, today is Tuesday. And then I take a piece of blue chalk and I write out, today is Tuesday. I'm writing the same message, appears to be the same, but the color chalk is very, very different. When you look, for instance, at even the 4 Gospels in the New Testament, you take, for instance, the writings they're all written in Greek. But if you take, for instance, the New Testament writings, Mark, for instance, was probably a soldier. His Greek is fairly pathetic, really rudimentary Greek. When you read Paul's letters, Paul was very erudite, and he's writing in beautiful Greek. John's gospel is somewhere in between them. So if God is dictating to all 3, then God sometimes is really speaking really good Greek and sometimes really poor Greek. So I do not believe in the notion of a dictation whatsoever. I think more like a kind of an inspiration, and depending on the channel, it can be more or less, inspiring to the reader subsequently. I happen to think that the 2 people who were inspired to write the Course in Miracles were very advanced spiritual beings, and so they allowed the water to come through in a very clear fashion. I used the image yesterday in a homily, I think, of if somebody asked me for, I lived at the edge of the desert for many years. If somebody asked me for a drink of water, and I take, water from a well, and it's pristine water, and I scoop it out, with a bucket, and the bucket is full of bacteria and what we say in Swahili, taka, rubbish of all kinds, and I offer you a drink from that. The original water may have been really, really beautiful, but what you're drinking is actually going to poison you. I use the same image where I live right now. I'm 10 miles from the nearest town. I'm 4 or 5 miles from PG&E. I have my own, a solar system for power. I got my own propane system for electricity. I have my own well. I had to dig down 260 feet to get water. And so I'm totally self-contained for this water. This water is coming from snow melt in the Sierras. It is pristine water. But the area in which I live is very geologically diffuse. And so as it's bubbling its way up through the surface, it's taking on a whole bunch of contaminants, a lot of heavy metals. And so I have to do a 3-party cleansing system. I have to turn hard water into soft water. I have to take all the those metals out of it. And then I have to make sure that there's not bacteria. I have to have ultraviolet radiation to hitting it. And so in order to drink the water, I have to purify it. The water from source is pristine, but the water that comes up out of the well is contaminated. Now, that's the same difference between religion and spirituality. Spirituality is the pristine waters from source. Religion is the contaminants that are taken on by dogmatic decrees. And anybody who is attempting to tunnel into the water table of God's self, is a channel, and no channel is perfect. And therefore, every single channel is going to leave their own imprint on what comes through. And so, for instance, even the choice of language, or the style or the vocabulary employed is kind of is very idiosyncratic to the writer or to the channel. So while I have a lot of respect for the Course in Miracles and for the two people who channeled it, I do not believe that God ever dictates any text to any person. That's my personal belief system. Yeah. That's a great question, Amy. There was actually an effort to do that at the beginning of the Christian era, that some of the church fathers believed that the God that came through in the Hebrew scriptures was a monster, and that they needed to ditch him completely and create the God that was preached by Jesus. And there was a very strong movement for over 100 years actually to do that. And it was eventually decided, no, we need to retain this material. And I agree with that decision in the sense that those who don't learn from history, are wont to repeat it. So it becomes really, really important for us that we retain the tracks of our evolutionary trajectory, even as spiritual people. And that along with, the original texts in the original languages with the original intentionality and the original mindsets be part of the record so that people can see where they've come from. But obviously they need to be supplemented, with newer translations, for instance, that are, that are not anti-women. So that needs to be represented. But, there are lots of other newer spiritual readings that are presenting the same ancient truths in a much more palatable fashion and maybe in a much more evolved fashion, because we're at a different stage of human history. But I would hate to see the tracks of where we've come from obliterated, because we're liable to backtrack if we don't realize just what we've come from. And so it's not a question of either or, it's a question of both and. Let us remember where we've come from and honor the insights of the people who created. In their time, they represented extraordinary spiritual breakthroughs from what they, had been handed on to them in oral traditions. And so we have to honor, just how much they achieved by recording what they did record. And at the same time, move on to new understandings of what a current articulation of those truths might be, and therefore new kinds of writings that would give us a more pertinent and relevant set of texts and stories in order to move forward. It's a great question, Amy. That's a great question. And so that happened at every stage of the process. So even I'll be doing this in much more detail tomorrow as well. Okay. But when you look at, the evolution of even the Hebrew scriptures themselves, there are several stages in that journey that, in the Hebrew scriptures are going from about 950 BCE to about, 400 BCE. And so in that 600-year period of time, there are several different redactions and editings that went on, and I'll talk about it in much more detail tomorrow. And so that happened even during the composition of the Hebrew scriptures themselves. And then, as you know very well, when you come into the Christian era, that when they were trying to decide which books, were scriptural and which weren't, because a lot of the early writings consisted of letters that were being traded between the churches in diaspora. So as the Christians began to move throughout the Roman Empire, because when you read the story, for instance, of Pentecost in the book, The Acts of the Apostles in chapter 2, you find out that there are Jews from all over the world that have gathered in Jerusalem for an annual feast, and then they disperse. So they're bringing the new Christian message back with them. So there are lots of Christian Jews in diaspora, and now they're having to kind of bring that message back to their home places. So, and they're trading letters with each other. Different communities are trading letters. So there's hundreds of letters going backwards and forwards between these communities. And the question was then, which of these letters are scriptural? So Paul wrote a whole bunch of them. He's credited with writing 13 of the 27, books of the New Testament. Now, he may not have written more than 7 of them, but at least he wrote at least 7 of them. So which of the letters that are being traded between the communities are regarded as, revealed or kind of inspired by God, and which ones are not? And so the church fathers had big problems for the first 200 years deciding which ones get in and which ones do we throw out. And so, for instance, there was a big discrepancy even at the time of Luther. Luther threw out the Epistle of James out of the New Testament because James insists on the importance of good works, and Paul was insisting on the importance of faith. So Paul is saying, it's not good works. You can't earn your way into heaven. It is faith in the Lord Jesus. Whereas James, the brother of Jesus, is saying in his epistle, what good is it if you come into the synagogue and you see a poor person who's hungry and you say, Shalom, my brother, and you don't feed them, or clothe them? What good is your faith if you're not, acting social justice? So there's this war goes on in the 1500s between Luther and James. And Luther wanted to throw the Epistle of James out of the Bible. But in the first 200 years particularly, there's this ongoing battle of all these letters which are being traded over the kind of the Christian world and the Roman Empire. Which ones are authentic, inspired, and need to be included, and which ones need to be thrown out. And that version, changed occasionally over the years, with some of the church fathers wanting to include books that other guys didn't want to include. So Saint Irenaeus, who flourished around 200, kind of more or less had the final say in what books is got in. Now, since that period of time, as you rightly point out, Johanna, there were lots of other texts that were written, apocryphal gospels of various kinds, the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, which were hidden because there was an effort to kind of sabotage and destroy all these books. And so there was a whole cache of material found in, but the Nag Hammadi texts were found from about 1945 to 47, and there was a whole cache of material written in Coptic Greek. And there were alternative kind of viewpoints. Mary Magdalene's Gospel of Mary Magdalene was actually found in a grave in the 1800s, in a monk's grave, in Egypt, and it was almost completely intact. There are a few pages missing, and there's a few holes, one very significant hole actually in one page, where the story is that when Mary begins telling the other apostles of a vision she had of Jesus, and they're really upset that Jesus would reveal himself post-mortem to a woman and not to them. And they're really jealous. And there's a phrase that says, why did Jesus kiss you on the? And there's a hole in the text. We don't know, was it kiss you on the forehead, kiss you on the tuchus, kiss you on the lips? We have no idea what it was. There's a hole in the physical text, where we would find out. But obviously they were really upset with Jesus because they said he regularly kissed Mary Magdalene. So now kissing can mean one of two things. Physically, it can mean a sign of affection or even romance. But much more importantly, it represented an oral transmission from the teacher to the student. And in either case, they're really upset that a mere woman could be a student of Jesus. And in fact, her own sister was really upset about this. There's the great story of Mary and Martha in Bethany, the story where Jesus comes from Jerusalem with his apostles, and they're really tired after a day's preaching, and he's sitting down in the living space, and the apostles are gathered around him, and Martha's in the kitchen cooking up a storm for these hungry guys, and Mary is sitting at the feet of Jesus. And Martha comes out, puts her hands on her hips and says, Mary, you going to let me do all the work? And Jesus turns very kind of, to Martha, says, Martha, you're busy about many things. Only one thing is necessary. Mary has chosen the better part. And the part Mary had chosen was to be a disciple of Jesus, because to sit at the feet of the guru meant to be a disciple. And the apostles are really upset. Now, there's a sequel to that story, which I made up myself. The next story in the gospel is that next day, Jesus and the disciples are going back into Jerusalem, and they see a fig tree, and they're really hungry. And they go over to pluck figs off it, and there are no figs in it. And Jesus curses it. And when they come back that evening, the fig tree has withered up. And they ask him, how come the fig tree withered up in a day? But the reason Jesus was hungry was, in the evening before, when very, very piously he said to Martha, Martha, you're busy about many things. Only one thing is necessary. Mary has chosen the better part. And Martha put her hands on her hip and says, fine, make your own bloody dinner. And she stormed out of the kitchen. And so the guys went to bed hungry. And that's why you have the story of the fig tree next day. So you get that, effort to kind of to keep women out of the Bible, even by her own sister at that stage, and certainly by the 12 apostles, and subsequently by the church fathers. And that material came to light, this Gospel of Mary, sometime in the 1850s in a monk's grave in Egypt, and subsequently a lot of other findings, the Nag Hammadi findings. Thanks, Teresa. Very, very, very potent. And of course, obviously, every translator brings their own agenda to it. Some of them bring a lot of scholarship. They bring scholarship, about the times in which the books emerged. They bring scholarship about literally even paleography, that there's a science of determining from manuscripts when an actual text was actually physically written. By styles of Greek, for instance, there was a period in Greek writing when there was no such thing as a comma. So if somebody, for instance, were to try to create a fake document and claim it came from early Greek, and you do a quick check, and there are commas in the text in the Greek, that it was a fake. It didn't come from the original. And so we have to be really, really careful that people who study paleography, ancient writing forms, have to know the culture out of which it emerged, have to know the spirituality. But then every individual is going to bring their own level of spirituality. And by comparing different versions, we're liable to get a deeper level of the truth. But everybody is going to leave their own imprint on the matter. Then with that as well is like, for instance, I've seen some translations of Hafiz's poetry, or Rumi's poetry, and a lot of it is lost. That the kind of the resonance and the kind of the literally the poetry of the original is lost in translation, depending on how good a poet the translator is. And if the translator is a poet themselves, then are they going to put their kind of version in order to make it poetic in English? Are they going to lose some of the original intent? So it's a very, very difficult process. And certainly we have to go into it with a lot of humility. There's also many, many years ago, there was a group of Christian scholars got together in order to try to figure out in the Gospels, the 4 Gospels, what in the Gospels was actually accurate. And they created what they called the red letter Gospels. And they literally went through the 4 Gospels. They had a consensus about which parts were actually spoken by Jesus or were factual and which ones were made up later. And the reason it was called the red letter Gospel, when they'd go through a passage, they had 3 beads, a black bead, a red bead, and a gray bead. And once they'd debated a particular text, each person would take a bead and put it into a cup, and then they'd count the beads. And so if there were 10 scholars present, and when they look at the cup, there's 9 red beads in it. So it means 9 of the scholars have agreed, yeah, we accept that this is real. If there are 7 black beads and said, no, 7 scholars say that this, because Jesus did not say this. And there's actually a version of the Bible, a printed version, where it's written in red. As you're reading through the New Testament, you see the texts are written in red that these scholars believe actually Jesus said, and that they call it the red letter Gospels. So there have been many, many different attempts by many different scholars over the years to try to represent more accurately what may have been the original intent. So it's a landmine as you step into it, and you need to realize that it is a landmine. At the same time, you need to research it and then allow the spirit of the story to speak to your own soul. I think actually the Jesuits did a very interesting translation 30 years ago called the Jerusalem Bible. Mm-hmm. And there are, often when you buy a Bible, there are several versions even of the same translation. There's the student version, there's the scholar version, and then there's the kind of general version. So you can buy a Bible where it just contains the material of the Bible itself. Or then you can buy a kind of a student version where it will give you an introduction to each book and tell you something about the genre of literature, the time it was written, the context out of which it arrived. And so if you get one of those and you read that, so before, for instance, you read the Gospel of John, there's maybe 5 or 6 pages that say, this is the genre of literature, this is the time it was written, this was the context out of which it arrived. So I would say either the Jerusalem Bible, or there's one called the New American Bible, Catholic edition. And again, there's a student version of that. And so if you're looking for it online, make sure it's one that includes essays at the beginning of each book and gives you a kind of a sense of what material you're going to encounter as you read through the book itself. Yeah.
Thank you
so either
so much.
the Jerusalem Bible or the New American Bible, Catholic edition. You're absolutely right, Ria. So not only was the Hebrew scriptures written from a very patriarchal society, Roman society was patriarchal, Christianity was very patriarchal, the Roman Catholic Church is still very patriarchal. And so any writings that emerge, any canonized writings, any sanctioned writings, whether they're encyclicals from a pope, or you had to, before, up to a short time ago, you had to get an imprimatur from the local bishop before a priest could publish any material. When I wrote my first book in Swahili it was 1983, it was called Ukweli ni Nini, the truth, what does that mean? I had to get the imprimatur of the local bishop, Raphael Ndingi, in order to publish it. So I was constrained by what I could actually say, and get the imprimatur. So any kind of official writings coming from the Catholic Church, even still, are subject to a whole bunch of censorship. So you're absolutely right. All of these things came out of a patriarchal society. Now, the truth is, we can't look back, 2,000 years later and kind of criticize them, because that was the stage of human evolution. We're at a different stage at this stage. So you can't blame a one-year-old baby for not being able to run, But if the child is not able to run at age 12 because he's sitting on the couch, eating chips or whatever, we got problems here. And so as we look back in history, we have to do two things. We have to learn from the stage at which they were at and rectify the shortcomings, and not kind of force our 21st century system on them. At the same time, we can't imitate it. We need to grow beyond it. And certainly there are parts of our society right now which are still misogynistic. Unfortunately, the Islamic world is still very misogynistic. Unfortunately, the Roman Catholic Church is still very misogynistic, which is, this is the blessing of COJ, that we got women priests. And so we have to make sure that, as we articulate our message, that we're a group on pilgrimage. We're a pilgrim people, which means that we're always advancing, and that what we take as a liberated position today and a kind of a very enlightened position today, in 100 years' time, somebody will look back and say, how could they have been so dumb, or so stuck in their belief systems? So absolutely, we have to embrace the realization that this literature came from a very patriarchal society. It's outlived its usefulness. We need to present new kinds of teachings for our times, but not get so wedded to our version that future generations, can't improve upon those. Great question, Ria. That's beautiful. And so the sanctity of anything has to do with the intentionality. So I believe, for instance, that actually everything is sacred. And so I've said many times during Eucharist, that when Jesus was at the Last Supper, when Jesus took bread, and created the first Eucharistic encounter, that there are four kind of code words that are used. And if you read through the New Testament, when you find these four code words, you're actually in the presence of a Eucharistic encounter, even if it doesn't look like a formal Eucharist. And the four codes are: he took, he blessed, he broke, and he distributed. And when I unpack these, here's what it means to me. He took means that Christ is receiving from Mama Gaia, from Mother Nature. He's not grabbing stuff. He's accepting gratefully what Mother Nature is offering. So that's the first thing, that we have to take from the earth with love and gratitude, what we're taking. He blessed. Blessing does not mean the imparting of benediction to a previously inert substance. It is recognizing the inherent sanctity of everything that exists. So when he took a piece of bread, he wasn't imparting sanctity to this piece of bread. He was recognizing that this is sacred in its own right. It's coming from Mother Earth. And then he broke, meaning he had the intention of sharing with those who didn't have bread. And then he distributed. He walked the talk. And so wherever you see those four code phrases, he took, he broke, he took, he blessed, he broke, and he distributed. You know you're in the presence of a Eucharistic encounter. Now, to get back to your kind of what makes, a piece of wood sacred that's inside in a box of crucifixes. Firstly, literally at the level of the wood itself, it's sacred because it came from a tree, something that flourished in the earth, something that took sunlight from the air and gave it to its root system, something that took, nutrients from the soil, and gave it to its leaf system, exchanging energy for. So the very wood out of which it was fashioned, that already is sacred. And now you take it home, and it represents for you some a sacred mystery, a symbol of a mystery of a death and a resurrection experience that happened 2,000 years ago. So that's a level of sacredness right there. And then you surround it with your intentionality. You assign to that piece of wood your own holiness code, your own spirit, and you're blessing, that piece of wood by kind of drawing forth what is taken from you and giving it what is in you. There's this dialogue that's happening between the spirit of the wood and the spirit of Drew. And that's happening nonstop. So in many, many, many different ways, it is sacred. And you're absolutely right. And part of the reason is that there was a mix-up in the original Latin between credo and cordo. And so credo in Latin means I believe, I give intellectual assent to a dogma, that the church tells me is revealed word of God. So that's an intellectual, assent to a fictitious dogmatic decree by the church. The word cordo means to give your heart to something. So instead of credo, it should be cordo. I give my heart to. So that means trusting the system. It's not a belief system. It's not a mental kind of assent to a doctrine. It's a full body trusting in the encounter with the bicycle or whatever. And so the image that comes to mind to me when I think about this is when a little baby decides to the soul decides to incarnate, and it decides to take occupancy in a female womb and to be born to a mother. The child isn't making an intellectual agreement there. I believe that when I'm born, I'll meet this woman who has a breast and milk and that she'll look after me and care for me. This is not a mental assent. There's a soul trusting on the child's part that as soon as it arrives, it will meet a mother and meet milk and meet nurturance. And so the child would just instinctively look around for the nipple, instinctively, and learn how to suck. And then look at the mother's eyes. Because the focal length of a baby is the distance between a mother's breast and her eyes. So the child is programmed to make eye-to-eye contact with the mother as soon as it's born. That's what I mean by trust. That's very different from a belief system. The child isn't doing a kind of a mental somersault to figure out, I wonder who the mother is, what will she look like, how will I recognize her? So it's built into the soul of the two beings that there's this agreement between them. And just as you get on your bicycle, there's, this trust between you, Drew, and this machine, the bicycle, that you're going to be a couple for the next 10 miles. When we founded COJ in 1997, we immediately set out that we were going to harvest all the great wisdom traditions of the planet for our Sunday readings. And that didn't just mean reading the Hebrew scriptures or the Christian scriptures or the Bhagavad Gita, or the Quran. It meant looking at great poets, great writers of all kinds, all over the world, and including them. And indeed, we've done that consistently throughout our 25 years. We've chosen readings from all over the world. And at the end of each reading, we always end by saying, these are words inspired by God. And so that's what we've done consistently. Now, I think the second part of your question was it you about a new kind of Bible, including these new kinds of readings? That has to be a totally different anthology. The Bible is self-contained in the sense that it represents, a 1,000-year period of the journey of the Judeo-Christian faith system, and we need to hold that and treasure that as a particular, precious artifact of our evolutionary trajectory. And not, try to append it or add to it or subtract from it. We need to hold that precious. We need to be able to engage with it again as a document of its time and be able to understand it, not just literally, but symbolically and mystically as well. As well as that, we need to create other anthologies, of great poetry and great wisdom literatures, which have, come throughout the last 2,000 years and are still being created by prophets and artists of our own times. So there's no reason why we can't multiply, the anthologies of available kind of spiritual and kind of inspirational literature. But I think we need to honor this other book because it has accompanied us through our childhood and our adolescence and our early adult years, all of us who come from the Judeo-Christian system. And we have to totally honor that, and refer to that, understanding how to unpack it as we do it and embrace the new readings. We need new stories for our time. We need new symbols for our time that unify us, not just as a human species, but all sentient life form within the cosmos. I predict that within the next 5 years, there's going to be very verifiable evidence given us finally by our government that we are not alone in this universe. And at that stage, the invitation is, how do we embrace, our extraterrestrial brethren? Either facetiously or intentionally. Pope Francis said about 2 or 3 years ago, if there are extraterrestrials out there and they come to Earth, I would be prepared to baptize them. And there's a whole, the Vatican Observatory, there's a very famous Jesuit priest who runs that, has spoken about the same thing. Within 5 or 6 years, everybody, even those who think this is, crazy mishegas, are going to realize we are not alone in the universe. And therefore, the stories that are going to be written in the future are going to be stories that incorporate that mystical reality and take it away from the fear-based notion of they're coming to gobble us up or to eat us alive. I'll give you a monosyllabic answer and then I'll expand on it. Yes, you can break it. So there's 2 very important distinctions here that we have to keep in mind. The first one is there's a very big difference between the genealogical heritage of the spacesuit that each one of us inhabits. And so genealogically, I'm 4% Neanderthal, in case you didn't guess it. Literally, on 23andMe, when I plug in my data, I'm 4% Neanderthal. And the other 96% is Celtic. So there's a genealogical ancestry, a chromosomal lineage that the spacesuit I adopt, makes me part of. And so once I incarnate, I'm clued into that lineage. And therefore, I have to work with that, chromosomal or biological lineage, very important. But however, I am not my spacesuit. And therefore, the soul, it's a kind of a holographic fractal of source. The soul itself is totally independent of the spacesuit. It's independent of time. It's independent of incarnation. But groups of souls, make what I call a preconception contract to come together in incarnation in order to create a drama that affords each member the ideal opportunity of learning new kinds of lessons. And those lessons often take several lifetimes. So a soul troupe may decide to incarnate as a family. Even if the roles change or the genders change, they will incarnate with the same group of souls for several incarnations until as a group, as a soul troupe, that they've taught each other as much as they can teach each other as a soul troupe, and then they can break their connection because they're not mandated to be part of the same group forever. The distinction might be with a soul mate, what we call in Gaelic an anamachara. I think there are souls, twin souls, who are literally, spun off, at the same time from God, and who will journey from incarnation to incarnation, appearing in each other's lives regularly. So distinguish between the biological heritage you have, and the spiritual heritage, and they're going to come together occasionally to dance for a period of a few dances, and then they may part company because they've learned what they needed to learn from each other. So the entire scriptures, Hebrew scriptures and Christian scriptures, are permeated with the patriarchal mindset. Now, it's compounded by the fact that different linguistic systems, have different issues with gender-specific pronouns. And so, for instance, in English, it's only a problem with the third person singular. Are you going to say he or she, or what are you going to use? In Hebrew, it's compounded because in the second person singular as well, it's a problem. Yes. If I say Baruch atah in Hebrew, it means blessed are you if I'm talking to a man. If I want to say blessed are you to a woman, I have to say Baruch at. It's a different pronoun. Even in the second person in Hebrew, you have to specify a gender. So it's more difficult even in Hebrew to kind of make it gender specific. Swahili didn't have that problem. If I say to you, for instance, in Swahili, ameenda nyumbani. Ameenda nyumbani could mean he went home, she went home, or it went home. I could be talking about a cow on the road home. And if I say ameenda nyumbani, you know, that ameenda, the there could represent a male, a female, or even a non-human mammal. And so in Swahili, it's not an issue. So these problems are compounded by our linguistic system. So, you know, they're part of the linguistic system. You have to radically, you know, start pruning a linguistic system to iron out these difficulties. But in general, you know, if you're coming out of a patriarchal era of human history, you're going to find misogyny all throughout that period. And that period did not just end, you know, with the arrival of Jesus. It extended right into New Testament times and right up through Christianity and currently in Roman Catholicism. Absolutely. So that's the whole mission then, Karen, of creating a personal cosmology. So it is the bringing to full awareness that which drives our behavior. So I talked about that 2 weeks ago. I quoted from a book I co-authored in 2013 with Ralph Metzner and Matt McKay, a little book called Why, What Your Life is Telling You About Who You Are and Why You're Here. And there was chapter 9 on that, differentiated between ideals and values and between a vision and a personal cosmology. And I pointed out that ideals, you know, are how we would be living if we were on our best possible game. Values are the compromises we make because of the environments in which we find ourselves. And I use the example of if you're driving a car, you know, there is a kind of a stated destination, which is your ideals, and there's an intended destination, which is your values. But the movement on of your hands on the wheel are going to determine, do you get to your kind of stated destination? Are you going to get to your kind of intended destination? So you might want to go to a place of love and compassion for everything else. That's your stated destination. But you find your hands on the wheel and you're making compromises constantly in order to go to your intended destination, which is, you know, to be successful in the world or not to make waves or whatever it is. So that's the first distinction that we have to make between ideals, you know, and values. The second one then is distinguishing between a vision and a personal cosmology. A vision is a kind of an overarching sense of what I want to achieve in life. A personal cosmology is the roadmap that's going to get me there. You know, the practicalities, what does that actually look like? And I've suggested many times that the skeleton of a personal cosmology revolves around the answer to 4 questions. Who is God? Who am I? Who is my neighbor? And what is my mission? And if I start seriously examining those questions, researching them, talking with others, you know, reading scriptures of various kinds, reading great poetry of various kinds, looking at great art of various kinds, I begin to again find answers coming kind of instinctively to those 4 questions. And at that stage, then there's a personal cosmology emerging. And now I have to measure my personal cosmology against the vision I have. Is this personal cosmology actually taking me towards that vision, or is it getting in my way? Because, you know, you're a unique individual. No other human being in the history of Homo sapiens sapiens has had the unique, you know, combination of experiences that you have had. And so your personal cosmology must be able to explain all of those to you and accommodate all those. It must stretch you, and it must make your heart sing. There has to be this feeling that, yes, this feels right, because it's aligning me with love and compassion. So you're getting this constant intuitive inner check constantly. But it's a lot of work. It has to be done on a daily basis, that that I measure my journey against my vision, that I measure, you know, my values against my ideals, you know, that I measure my personal cosmology against the vision, you know, that I've outlined every day.